Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The JAYREELZ podcast.
What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits. June is in full bloom as we inch that much closer to the official start of summer. And the same can be said for the latest podcast, as I'm here to fill you in on all that's going on in sports, as this is the JAYREELZ podcast with your host, JAYREELZ. For my first timers, welcome aboard. And for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even as early as this past Thursday, I welcome you guys and gals back. And now that we have the final set in both the NBA and NHL, and I'm going to take this as a two-pronged attack because I want to look at this more of a big picture. And people are going to say, JAYREELZ, it's the finals. What big picture are we looking at here? We've already whittled down those teams from 16 when we started about, 6 weeks ago, to now the final two in each of the sports, whether it's the hardwood or the ice. Well, I'm going to put it to you this way. I'm sure that if you're the commissioners of each of those sports, whether your name is Adam Silver in the NBA or Gary Bettman in the NHL, and that's where I'm going to start, because the NHL had their two games over the weekend where the NBA has been idle since Thursday, and obviously I'll unpack all that as we get set for game one of the finals in the NBA on Thursday. But the NHL is where I want to start. And if you're Gary Bettman, as you saw what took place last night, and I'm sure you were ecstatic. Now, maybe you would have preferred to have a game 7, which would have been Tuesday night in Dallas for all the marbles, because as we all know, game 7s, those are the two best words in sports. And for that to not happen now, and looking at what transpired, not only just last night, but even on Friday, and I'll get to Friday's game as well. But again, we're talking big picture here, people. For Gary Bettman, I'm sure he was ecstatic knowing that the Edmonton Oilers won last night and were able to clinch the Camel Conference, the Western Conference, as it is, and as we all know. But just to know that you have the game's brightest star, the MVP that has gone back-to-back, and maybe for a third one, as he's in the running between Nathan MacKinnon of Colorado, and Nikita Kucherov of the Tampa Bay Lightning. And for him to get to, not necessarily the mountaintop, but he's getting close. For him and his team to get to a Stanley Cup Final, as I'm sure Gary Bettman, that Sauvignon Blanc or whatever beverage that he chooses went down rather smooth last night, although maybe there's a part of him that would have loved to have seen the game 7 and maybe Edmonton win. I'm sure he was ecstatic. And he could talk about how much he's even more ecstatic to know that they're going to go up against the Florida Panthers, who went to the Cup Final, as we know, last year before losing in 5 to the Vegas Golden Knights, and for everything that they bring to the table. But if you were to give the commissioner truth serum, and when you take a look at what happened 24 hours prior to that in Sunrise, where the Rangers needed to stay alive, they were down 3-2, and they ended up falling short, losing 2-1. I'm sure if you were to ask him, who would you rather have in the Stanley Cup Final coming out of the East, knowing that Edmonton was already there? In the West, I get it the day after. He would have signed in blood that the Broadway Blue Shirts, one of the original 6 teams, the New York Rangers, would be right there with the Edmonton Oilers for game 1 this Saturday, which would have been at Madison Square Garden. But obviously that's not the case. And I don't care how he slices it. I don't care how he cuts it. And yes, will it be an entertaining final? I'll get to more of that later on in the week, because the final does not start until Saturday, as we know. And that will be in Sunrise, because if you had a situation where the Stars were to be the Western Conference champs, Florida would have to go to Dallas to play game 1, but instead now they have the home ice with the better record, point total, etc. So for Bettman, I'm sure he's going to spin it how he wants to spin it. Yes, a team that went to the Cup last year is now back on this same stage. And obviously with Connor McDavid and the Edmonton Oilers, considering what they had to go through throughout the course of the year, starting off, as I've talked about a million times, I know they went 3-9, started off 2-8, and I thought it was 2-10. I know I've been saying 2-10, although 2-10 sounds a lot better if you're an Oiler fan as of this moment. But they had that rough start. They fired Jay Woodcroft, their head coach. They bring in Chris Knobloch, and away we go. And here they are, winners of the Western Conference. So I don't care what Gary Bettman's going to say. I know Edmonton and the Rangers would have been just sexy beyond belief, as I detailed just a couple of minutes ago. But now you have Edmonton and Florida and how these two teams got here when we take a look at over the weekend. And I'll start with Edmonton because that story is intriguing to say the least. Here's a team with that rough start. Coach gets fired. They bring in the new coach. They went on a 16-game winning streak throughout the early part of Knobloch taking over as coach. Then later on, they went through an 8-game winning streak, or I may have that in reverse, but I know they had a 16-gamer and an 8-gamer. And then they get into the postseason, and even though they were battling there a little bit with Vancouver, although Vancouver seemed to have them, as far as the division out in the Pacific, pretty much wrapped up, but Edmonton was kind of creeping close and thinking whether or not they had an outside shot to win the Pacific Division. But that wasn't the case. They did get the number 2 seed in the division where they hosted the Kings in the first round. And even though the Kings came out pretty tough in the outset, splitting those first 2 games, as we know, up in Edmonton, but then the Oilers went on to win that series. And then to piggyback that, you have to look at what they did in that Vancouver series, because remember, up and down, in and out, as I've said time after time, we don't know which Edmonton Oilers team is going to show up. And as it was, they were down 3-2 against Vancouver, who are arguably one of the top teams in the sport, second behind Dallas in the West, but they were also amongst the top 2 and arguably could have been a 1 seed when it was all said and done, but they had issues down the stretch. Their goalie, Thatcher Demko, who was lost early on in the postseason. I know that was a big blow for the Canucks, but they still had a 3-2 series lead against the Oilers, and then Edmonton not only won Game 6 in their building, but they won Game 7 on the road and had to hang on for dear life in the conference semis before getting here to Dallas. And then what did we see? We saw them win a Game 1, and then they were able to get that pivotal Game 4 that they needed big time in order for them to get back in the series. And then what was that? They won a Game 5, as we know, and on Friday night, where they went out to a 3-0 lead before they tacked on a goal there late in the third by the Stars, and the 2 goals there by Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, the elder statesman of the team, the longest tenured player on the Edmonton Oilers, who got those 2 goals to get them started Friday night in Dallas. And then now it transitioned to the point where they got a Game 6, a closeout game in their building. And I talked about this on the podcast Thursday. When we looked at Edmonton, will the real Edmonton Oilers team stand up here? Because from one game to the next, we do not know what we're going to get here. And as we saw, not only did they win a Game 5 in Dallas, I thought to myself, the Dallas Stars are going to win last night, because the Stars have been very resilient. We've chronicled what they've done throughout the course of this postseason. And I'll say it one last time, because we're not going to talk about the Stars until we get to the NHL preview sometime in the early part of October. But they were down 0-2 at home to the Vegas Golden Knights before winning that series and having to come all the way back from that. They lost Game 1 in the next round, where it looked like they were going to be in a pickle against the Colorado Avalanche, but they were able to go ahead and dispose of them. And even after losing Game 1 to the Oilers and having to go back to Dallas tied at 2, they lose a bad Game 5 in their building. And then last night, as we move forward to that, the Oilers get off to a 2-0 lead. 2 power play goals, one by Connor McDavid, which was unbelievable. Him just weaving through traffic, getting in front of the net, and lifting it on the backhand, top shelf over Jake Ettinger, or Ottinger. I always say Ettinger. But for him to get that opening goal, which got the crowd going, and then Zach Hyman with a power play goal later in the period, 2-0. And here's what you need to know about the Dallas Stars, especially what they said in the postgame. Now, they did get a goal by Mason Marchment there with about a little bit over 10 minutes to go in the third period, and they did have opportunities down the stretch where they pulled the goalie at 2-1. They had a golden opportunity where a pass went right through the crease, and they had 2 Dallas Stars players, for whatever reason, they missed the puck and had a semi-open net to where they could have tied the game at that point. And then in the closing seconds, Jason Robertson looked like he had a great opportunity in the slot, which went wide, and that was it. And to the point where Jamie Benn, of course, one of the key players on the team, captain, came out and said that the Stars probably played their best game of the series. And think about it. You could argue whether or not they did, even though they were in that 2-0 hole and they tried to get the equalizer there late, but they only gave up, think about this, 10 shots on goal in the game. Edmonton tied a record dating back to the 90 Bruins, I believe in the conference final, to where they had 10 shots in, I don't know if it was in a game clincher, but 10 shots on goal. And for Edmonton to come out alive and win that game and to win the conference and go on to a Stanley Cup, I'm sure if you're Peter DeBoer, the coach, and obviously the players on that team, that flight home has to be the longest flight they ever had. And have to be sick to their stomach, considering it's not as if the Oilers peppered Ottinger with 40 shots on goal and literally stood on his head to keep that team alive. It was almost as if they got those 2 goals and Edmonton just sat on it the rest of the game. In fact, they only had 2 shots on goal in the final period. So I know they have to be shaking their heads this morning, wondering what went wrong. How did this all just blow up in their faces? And you understand you have to give Edmonton just a considerable amount of credit, detailing everything I had to go through, especially in the previous round, down 3-2, having to win a Game 7 in Vancouver, hanging on for dear life, down 2-1 in this series to win in the final 3 games. And it's interesting because the Stars, although a lot of people thought that they were going to go to a Cup final, them being a 1 seed and a team that was obviously formidable in their own right, but they've also had a lot of moments where it made you doubt, although very resilient, but whether it was in the Vegas series, even Game 1 Colorado, and even losing a Game 1 against the Oilers, but you thought that they would have found the way to win this series, and that was not the case. So if you're a Dallas Stars fan, I get it. Back-to-back years, you went to conference finals, you lost in 6 games. On top of the start of the decade, losing in the pandemic year, I understand, but losing a Cup final to Tampa, this has to be not only just a brutal loss, but one that may take a while for the Stars franchise to recover, because the Stanley Cup was pretty much right in your sights. And with those opening rounds, the way you played and the way you bounced back, and now for it to fall short the way it did, and to come across and say that this was probably the best game that they played all series, and it was a loss, doesn't get any worse than that. But for Edmonton, you have to give it up. I've been rooting for this team throughout, for them to get to this point. Connor McDavid, his first ever Stanley Cup final, which I know he's going to relish beyond belief. And for all the other players on that team, obviously Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, as I mentioned, the longest tenured player on the team. You also have Leon Draisaitl, Zach Hyman in the postseason that he's had, just phenomenal. And now they get to share the stage with the Florida Panthers. And with what they did, dating back to Thursday, because I talked about how the series at 2-2, I wouldn't have been surprised if the Panthers won the next 2 games to win the series, or even if the Rangers did so, or if the Rangers won Game 5 and then the Panthers won the following 2 games, or if the Panthers won Game 5 and the Rangers won the following 2. That's how crazy the series has been and how tight and hotly contested that it was. So when you go back to Thursday night, the Rangers took a 1-0 lead early as Chris Kreider finally got on the scoreboard in the series on a shorthanded goal just 2 minutes in, and you probably thought to yourself, now the Panthers are going to have to stem the tide here. They certainly did 6 minutes later with a goal by Kristaps Porzingis. And then you had to go all the way to the third period, tied at 1, before Anton Lundell got the, in all purposes, the game-winning goal, although that wasn't the deciding goal, because when you look at it, they got an empty netter later on from Sam Bennett before they got a late goal there by, I believe it was Alexis Lafreniere. I may have to double-check that. It could have been, no, Panarin got the goal there in Game 6. But they tacked on a goal there late with the extra man advantage at 3-1. But Lundell had the big goal there to make it 2-1. And then that propelled the Panthers to get the empty netter, even though the Rangers did tack on that goal there late. And Mika Zibanejad, who has been a no-show in this series and had that costly turnover there, which led to the penalty in Game 4 where the Panthers won in overtime. And Zibanejad, although he did have a couple of assists, but again, a no-show in the series. So with the Panthers winning Game 5 and then having the game in their building in a Game 6, and for the Panthers to get out to a 1-0 lead early on, and then they sat on that pretty much, it seemed like the whole game. And even though the Panthers, who had played physical, who had played as if they were in a phone booth, their defensive discipline and just suffocating the ice, not getting the Rangers to skate and just be all over the ice for the aforementioned Kreiders, the Zibanejads, even the Artemi Panarins, who did get a goal there late with the extra man. But you had the big goal there by Vladimir Tarasenko, the former Ranger who played on the Rangers just a year ago. And Tarasenko, who, for what we've watched, had played well, but hadn't been the scorer that he was with the Blues, who won a cup there in 2019. And for him to get his first goal in 8 games here throughout this playoff, to make it 2-0, and everybody thought that that was going to be the clincher. Although Panarin did get that goal with about 1:40 to go, but the Rangers did not have the opportunity similar to what the Stars had yesterday, as they were just trying to survive, to get the game tire, to try to at least push it into overtime. The Rangers, all their energy that they tried to muster in that final 1:40 went for naught, as the Panthers, for the second year in a row, clinch the East, go on to a Stanley Cup Final. And one more time, as we get it here full circle, Gary Bettman, I'm sure you're going to be ecstatic. I'm sure you're certainly happy to know that Connor McDavid is there. And for the hockey fan, and even for the good or die-on sports fan, they're going to pay attention to that. But how will that be in the ratings, especially when you have Florida there? Granted that they're a team that's gone back-to-back, and also a team that is pretty much nondescript to the average sports fan. When it's the Rangers, and granted they may not pick out the Rangers in a lineup, but the regular sports fan or the good sports fan know who the New York Rangers are. Florida Panthers, not so much, even with them showing up here on the Stanley Cup Final here for 2 years in a row. So now as we get to the storylines leading into Thursday's podcast, I'll break down more of the series at that time. But this is what you're looking at here. You're going to look at proper rest. It's going to be a week for the Panthers and about 5 days, 6 days for the Oilers, because they were at home. It's not as if they had to travel from Dallas back home, and that's going to take some time. And even though they still have a week to prepare and rest, but you would think that the week is going to be good for both teams. It's not as if it's a turnaround time, 48 or even 72 hours for both of these teams. They're going to be well rested, maybe a little bit rusty. Maybe it will be almost like two fighters, two heavyweights going at it there to kind of feel each other out in that opening game come Saturday night down in Sunrise. But you would think there shouldn't be much rust. Both teams are going to have these pretty much the same amount of time off, so that's one thing you're going to look at here. McDavid's first final, as I talked about, how he's going to perform on this stage is going to be huge. He's finally gotten to this point. I know I'm ecstatic for him. And trust me, I'm not an Edmonton Oilers fan in the least, as I talked about a few weeks ago here on the podcast. But this is going to be his time to shine. This is going to be his time to show the world. And I talked about this on a podcast last year. He is sports' invisible superstar, because he's a guy that flies under the radar mainly because of the sport he plays and where he plays. Because if he played, let's say, a la Gretzky when he got traded from Edmonton to LA in the late 80s, if he played in LA, or dare I even say, if he played in New York, Chicago, Detroit, even Montreal, Toronto, one of those original 6 teams, and I'll even throw in the Boston Bruins as well, he would be a megastar. And the thing is, he's already a megastar. But that just goes to show you how under the radar he is when it comes to the landscape of superstars in the world of sports, whether your name is Patrick Mahomes, whether your name is even Mike Trout or even Aaron Judge in baseball, or for the NBA, you want to talk about LeBron, although he may be, obviously he's going to be 40 years old, but you want to still talk about him or any of the other top stars in the sport. Nikola Jokic. Connor McDavid belongs on that same level. But because this is his first final, which is kudos to him, and him being that guy that he could walk down any street in America and people will not spot him. Maybe they'll spot him now because he has the beard and if they've been paying attention. But my point is that he's a guy that is just unassuming, goes about his business, typical hockey player style, but certainly not a guy that you could pick out of a lineup or think that wherever he goes, he's going to be mobbed by people. So for McDavid to get here, even Leon Draisaitl, his sidekick there in Edmonton, and of course, when you think of Edmonton, you think about Wayne Gretzky, Yari Curry, Paul Coffey that you saw on the ice there yesterday during the celebration. You're going to think about those Edmonton Oilers teams. And it was 40 years ago last month where the Edmonton Oilers won their first ever Stanley Cup. And it is the first time they've actually been in the Stanley Cup since 2006 as an 8th seed when they played the Carolina Hurricanes. And they went to a 7th game before losing to Carolina during that Stanley Cup final. So those are your storylines there when it comes to Edmonton being a part of this Stanley Cup. And I'm sure it's going to be one that is going to be very entertaining. High flying, we know the type of team they are. And even though their goaltending and defense could be very spotty, but guess what? They're the last team standing in the Western Conference and will represent them come Saturday, as we know. And then as far as the Panthers, I've talked about it. Back-to-back Stanley Cup Finals. This is the third time that they've been to a conference final, and they've won all three of them. 96 when they beat the Penguins in a Game 7 in Pittsburgh with Mario Lemieux. That year before getting swept by Colorado. Last year, as we know and talked about with Vegas, and then now here against Edmonton. And we know about this team. They're going to come at you fast, physical, hard, and they're a team that's going to try to do what they did to the Rangers with Edmonton here. Slow down their speed, slow down their quickness, contain their top players as they did throughout the course of the series against the Rangers. But obviously, this is going to be a step up because when you look at what they've done throughout the course of this postseason, Zach Hyman, what does he have, 12 goals so far in the playoffs? We know about, obviously, McDavid and Draisaitl, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, the Evander Kanes of the world, the Evan Bouchards on defense. Yeah, they have stars everywhere. And I get it. It's going to be a tall task. But Florida, been there, done that. Maybe you're going to look at Edmonton as a team that, although they have the talent, but because they don't have a lot of experience as players being in a cup final, I believe they have 5 players that are representative of Edmonton that are been in cup finals in the past that are going to be there, obviously, this coming weekend. So how I look at it is the Panthers know what it takes to play in a Stanley Cup final where you only have 5 players there, and what's going to happen with the travel, too. You got to think about Edmonton to Florida certainly isn't a 2-hour flight, and I understand that the Panthers have to take that same flight as well, but they at least are well-versed knowing that a year ago they can look at their experiences and what they had to go through in order for them to get to this point. And there isn't really any rivalry between the two, unlike the NBA, which we'll get to. And not to say that there's a rivalry there, but there are more juicier storylines with the NBA than in that final than it is with this final. A lot of it is based on the team itself and not players against the former opponent, or the former team, I should say, going up against that opponent. So for this Stanley Cup final, and let me see if I covered everything when it comes to that. That's pretty much it when we look at this final on a whole, because I can't say anything else. I know Paul Maurice is trying to get to win a Stanley Cup. He's been to a Stanley Cup before with the Hurricanes, not that year that they won the Cup, 4 years prior when they played the Red Wings and lost. And Maurice obviously was there last year, so this is his third crack at it. And Chris Knobloch coming in as the interim coach at the time and then now getting to a Cup final has to be just otherworldly and complete nirvana for him and for that organization. So that's what you have. I'm looking forward to it. We'll break down the X's and O's and get into not even just storylines, but just a complete analysis of what the Stanley Cup final will be on Thursday's podcast. And then now to stay with that big picture theme as I take off the skates and lace up the high tops. For Adam Silver, if I was he and I looked at what happened here, you knew you had to have the Celtics there in the NBA final, and we saw that dating back a week ago when they swept the Pacers. Jaylen Brown was your MVP. All right, fine. But then now when you looked at Dallas and Minnesota, and when we were on the pod last Thursday where it was about to be a Game 5 that night, where the Mavericks were just one win away. They couldn't sweep the Timberwolves as they got Game 4 down in Dallas. And then there was a little bit of a thought that maybe with the game in Minnesota, could the T-Wolves push it to a game number 6 and really put the pressure on Dallas? Well, before I get to the game, I'm sure that Adam Silver would look at this scenario, whether it was Boston, Minnesota, or Boston, Dallas. I'm sure he would have taken Boston, Dallas first and foremost. But really, if you gave him true serum, and even though, like I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, the juicy storylines are there when it comes to this final now between Boston and Dallas, but I'm sure he would have liked to have the current MVP and the reigning defending champs, Denver Nuggets, there in the final with the Celtics, because that would have been maybe the team that went to a final 2 years ago, now back in the finals to go up against a team that is already the defending champ, to have that man in the arena gladiator moment to see if the Celtics could finally get Banner 18, to see if they could beat the man so they could be the man. You're not getting that. Obviously, Denver was disposed by Minnesota in the previous round. But what you got there Thursday night, if you watched anywhere past the midway point of the second quarter of Game 5 between the T-Wolves and Dallas Mavericks, then you're a better man than me, because that game got away from the Timberwolves in a hurry. As you got toward the end of the first quarter, the score was already 35-19, and you thought to yourself, all right, let's see if Minnesota could put a run together, maybe get back in this game, cut it to less than 10, and it just went off the rails. And I don't know if that was more of Dallas having the FU moment to say, we're not letting this game get out of hand, we're going to put the proverbial foot on their necks, or Minnesota just capitulated. They just said, to hell with it. We're not coming back in this game. Luka and Kyrie are just too strong. They both had 36 points each in the game, and there was nothing to watch once you got pretty much halfway through the second quarter as the Mavericks cruised to a Western Conference title, cruised through a game number 5, and now you have the stage set in Boston, game 1, between the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics. And I will say this, for the T-Wolves, major disappointment. I don't care how you slice it. You got to give it up to Dallas and what they did. Absolutely. But they're going to look back at game 2, not closing out that game, because at least they would have got back to Minnesota, tied it 2, and right. Would the game gotten out of hand if that was the case, if it was even at 2? We'll never know. But even with them showing up in game 4 and showing a little pride to hang in there and maybe give us a sense of, all right, well, maybe can the T-Wolves come out and win this game to push it back to Big D and maybe give the Mavericks something to think about? Not a chance. And to me, that's an indictment on maybe the coaching staff. You could look at Chris Finch and maybe say, hey, were your players not prepared? Did they think that, we're just going to win this game? It was going to be an automatic? And you can look back at what Anthony Edwards said at the end of game number 4 as he was talking to Micah Parsons, and he said, yeah, I'll be back for game 6 to give you my shoes. His sneakers, that is. And we all know you can't say things like that, because the sports gods, the basketball gods, they're always listening. And not to say that that was the reason why they lost, but for them to put up that stinker, to be literally a no-show in that game. You lose a game 5 down the stretch, similar to what they did in games 1 and 2. Yes, it's a gut punch. Yes, it's tough to watch. Yes, it's tough to stomach. But at least they showed up. The fans in that building in game 5, they were watching a slow death. And those are the worst games to watch. Now, I understand. Those are games that you can just erase from your memory. And yes, as a big-time T-Wolf fan, to my guy Head Style, I'm sure maybe he's still licking his chops. But for the Timberwolves to just lay down like dogs, for them to just not even put up a fight. And yes, I get it, the aggressiveness and even just the all-out assault that the Mavericks put forth, and they thought, we're not going back to Dallas with a game 6 in mind. We're putting this series to rest. And that's what they did, and then some. Makes you think whether or not Minnesota, on top of what they did in the previous series to beat the defending champs, certainly puts a big giant question mark around that team, whether or not they were ready to take that next step. Or maybe they thought after beating Denver, maybe in the back of their minds, they felt as if, well, we beat the defending champs and we have home court. We're going to just take care of Luka, Kyrie, and company and just get themselves to an NBA final as if they were on roller skates. And obviously that was far from the case. So for Dallas, give it up. And now as we get to the storylines here for game 1 on Thursday, and because thankfully I have a podcast on Thursday, I'll unpack all of the breakdowns, analysis, and give you predictions as well for what I think will take place in that series. But you want to talk about juicy storylines that you may not have in Edmonton, Florida, you certainly have here. And the first one we have to get on is not necessarily rest, it's rust. The Celtics will be 10 days off from the time they beat the Indiana Pacers to game 1 when they tip off there around 8:30 on Thursday night. So you have to wonder, they can prepare all they want. They had a few days off before their first practice there on Friday. And now as they ramp up their reps and preparation, etc., but still, you could simulate games, you could have similar workouts, do all the sprints you want, but nothing is like being in the moment of game time, bright lights, NBA Finals, etc. Now, thankfully, this team has been around the block dating back to 2 years ago, and I'll get to that in a minute. But as far as rust goes, and even with the Mavericks, they're going to have a full week off from the last time they played that Game 5 to Game 1, so you have to wonder. I get it. It's a time to heal. It's a time to rest up. It's a time to just get everything just intact. But more so for the Celtics than I think for the Mavericks. Will Russ play a factor in Game 1? That we'll have to wait and see. Kyrie's return to Boston. Now, this is, again, we've seen this before. We saw it when he was a member of the Brooklyn Nets when he made his first trip into Beantown with the sage and trying to get all the demons or whatever went down in those previous 2 years when he played in Boston, 2017-18 and 18-19. Whatever juju he tried to get out of the building, who knows if he's going to do that again before Game 1 as he goes to shoot around 5 hours before the game or whatever it may be. But we've seen this movie. We've seen this before. He's played against them in the playoffs, beat him in the playoffs, and then, of course, lost to them in the playoffs, as we know, as the last time Kyrie stepped in that building as an opponent in a postseason setting was just 2 years ago when the Celtics went to an NBA final. So you have that scenario, which is already taken care of, but because now this is the finals, you know it's going to be ratcheted up, and hopefully the fan base acts accordingly. You know that's not going to be the case. You know there's going to be a lot of FU Irvings or FU Kyries that's going to be from the rafters all the way on down, which you'd like to have a little bit more class. You want to get on Kyrie, you want to chirp and do all that, that's fine, but can we keep it a little classy? We know that's probably not going to happen, but that's going to be one storyline there. Luka's first ever NBA final, which I'm sure with all the comparisons between he and Larry Bird, that's going to dredge up here over the next few days leading into Game 1, and how Luka's just been an assassin. He's been a killer. You've seen him on the court, whether screaming at Rudy Gobert or to the T-Wolf team or to the stands, etc. You're going to see a lot of that here, and I'm sure the Garden Faithful, as much gasoline they're going to try to put on that fire, I'm sure Luka's going to try to shoot that back at them times 10. So if you want to, Celtic fans, and here's a little bit of a tidbit. You want to fire up Kyrie? Do that. Don't fire up Luka. And I'm sure if Luka's going to be bitching and moaning at the refs, and I would think there's going to be an expletive or two towards Luka, maybe it would be safe not to do that. But you have Luka there as far as a storyline, being in his first final and being on this stage and how he's going to perform. Then you also have Jason Kidd. And the reason why I bring him up is because now for the generation prior, when he was a New Jersey Net, and how in back-to-back years, 2002 and 2003, conference final and conference semis, how his net teams disposed of the Celtics. And people are going to say, well, JAYREELZ, why are you bringing that up? That happened 21, 22 years ago. Who cares? Well, Kidd has a history with that fan base. And I understand it's an older fan base at that time. But remember, when the Celtics were going at it with the Nets, especially more so in that conference final, they had that big comeback in Game 3 before the Nets took over and they won in 6 games. And then the year after, they swept the Celtics. But there were a lot of vitriol spewed toward Kidd. And mind you, again, long time ago, but you do have a little bit of that angle where I'm sure the crowd is probably going to remind Jason Kidd of that time. And I know there were signs, especially what would happen to Paul Pierce's health that year, and people just trying to just equate that and put that on a big giant oak tag toward the head coach at the time, of course, player with the Nets. There could be a little bit of that left over or remnants of that, but I'm just bringing that up now because who knows? Maybe there'll be some just spewing directed toward the head coach. And I also look at Kidd versus Mazzulla as an interesting matchup and storyline because Mazzulla, second year, conference final last year, NBA final this year, going up against Kidd, who's been around the block as a coach, been around the block as a player. The Mavericks, their first time in an NBA final since they won it 13 years ago when they beat the Heat in 6. And Kidd, who may not be Pat Riley or Red Auerbach, but look at what he's done here throughout the course of this year, getting this team as a 5 seed to get themselves to an NBA final. What was their record? 50-32, I believe, throughout the course of the season. So he's done a masterful job. And it'll be interesting to see how he's going to put the chess pieces on the board up against Mazzulla, who's done fine in his own right here, especially in that Pacers series. And granted, people can say, oh, wait a minute, they swept them. How big of a job he did? Well, putting in Tatum and taking him out to get rest at certain periods and moments and drawing up the play for the inbounds to Jaylen Brown in the corner. Now, I understand Jaylen Brown had to make the shot. If he missed it, this would be a non-story, but you have to factor in some of the things Missoula has done to this point. And how I look at it is, Kid Missoula is going to be an interesting matchup, because a couple of years ago when it was Missoula versus, or really it was Ime Udoka. I can take that back because it was Udoka who brought them there as the coach. But even last year when Missoula went up against the Miami Heat in the conference final, when you have Spoelstra and what he means to the coaching fraternity in the league, and even though they were down 0-3, they came all the way back, but we saw what happened in Game 7. I get it, Tatum with the ankle, but I think that's going to be an interesting storyline between those two coaches right there. And then on the Celtics side, the first thing that comes to mind is twofold. Kristaps Porzingis, not only he's going up against his former team, and even maybe how it ended when a lot of people thought that the Kristaps-Luka marriage was going to be a fruitful one, considering you had your big against Luka, a guy, as we all know, facilitator, a guy that is going to make his teammates better. And even though there seemed to be a little bit of a falling out, and I'm sure there's going to be some stories that may be coming about over the course of the next 3 days leading into the finals, but for Kristaps to go up against his former team, A, but even more importantly, B, is his health. Because a lot of people think that if Kristaps is going to be healthy and is going to play in this series consistently, he could be that X factor. Because his size, his length, his shooting, etc. could be a thorn to the Maverick side. And I'll get into more of that on Thursday, as hopefully we'll have a better idea and understanding of whether or not he's going to be ready to play in Game 1. Based on what we've read in the reports about how he's getting better, he's getting close. To me, that doesn't mean anything. I want to know, is he going to be in the lineup come Thursday night? Now, is he going to start or is he going to come off the bench? That remains to be seen. But think about it. He's already had 38 days off. Remember, he hurt himself, I believe it was Game 4 of the opening round series against Miami. So he didn't play in Game 5. Then they had whatever it was, 3 or 4 days off before the Cavalier series, which they disposed of them in 5, then had another 3 or 4 days off before they swept the Pacers, and now they've had 10 days off. So he's had literally well over a month, almost a month and a half before, and it's a calf injury. And I get it, calf injuries, you gotta proceed with caution. Look at what happened to Kevin Durant years ago. You could even talk about maybe Aaron Rodgers, who had a little bit of a calf injury, and then we saw what happened there, the opening series last year, Monday night against the Bills. So totally understand and get it. But come on now, you have the best doctors, the best treatment, etc. And I get it. He was hobbling off that court down in American Airlines, or now it's what, Kaseya Center. So 100%. But you are 28 years of age, you're a young guy, and I would think that your body's going to respond a little bit better now. Granted, he's had a ton of injuries throughout the course of his career, but still, you would think he's going to be ready for Game 1. If he's not going to be ready for Game 1, I don't know if we're going to see him in a series at all. And you would think he wants to get a ring, he wants to feel like he earned it, and go up against his former team. Come on now. So you have that storyline if you're the Celtics, and even in that case with Kristaps Porzingis. Another thing here that we're going to look at is the experience factor. That's going to be huge. And you heard Al Horford say the other day, I believe it was on Friday's practice, where he came out and said that 2 years ago, there were a lot of distractions. I'm sure people wanted tickets. People wanted to spend the night, family coming in, so on and so forth. And for a young team, especially with Ime Udoka, who was a young coach, I'm sure it engulfed the team. And maybe a lot of the onus and the attention wasn't fully. Now, I could say, yeah, a lot of it was fully on basketball. But of course, in the back of your mind, oh, I got ticket requests. Oh, I got family coming in. Oh, I got people that wants to stay in my home, or whatever it may be. And maybe for a young Celtic team, that was the difference between Golden State winning and Boston losing. Now, big picture, probably not. But the Celtics did have a 2-1 series lead and are up by 4 with 5 minutes to go. And that's not to say, while they're on the court, they're thinking about, oh, wait, I got to make sure that my kid has to get fed tomorrow morning by the nanny, or have the car service come pick us up. I get it, they're not thinking about it at that time, but still, you have to wonder whether or not, by what Horford said, that it attributed for the Celtics maybe not being locked in, laser focused on them to win the series, where they know what it takes to play in the finals. They know what the outside noise and even some of the outside things that maybe they can't really control, maybe they can control it better this time around. And even Jason Tatum said that this go-around is going to be much different from the first time around. And even Jaylen Brown said it, this is a different team than 2 years ago. And they're absolutely right. When you bring in a guy like Drew Holiday, who won a championship in 2021, and granted, could be that guy who played well in the Pacers series, got the big strip there, as we know, in Game 3, and was a guy that made big shots, had 28 points in Game 1 of that series. He could be that guy that the team, I'm sure, they're going to rally around and say, hey, what do we do in this spot? How do we handle this, etc. And even though Drew Holiday may not be that rah-rah type of guy, he's not the Kevin Garnett where he's going to pound his chest and yell into the stands, but he knows what it takes to not only be around the finals, just like this team does, but he knows how to win a final. And that's going to be huge. And when we talk about the breakdown of the series, there are so many things to unpack here. I can't wait to discuss it, but we're going to have to wait till Thursday's podcast. Same for the Stanley Cup Final, to get into the weeds on anything and everything that has to do with both of the fall and winter sports, to get into it. So that's what you have there when we take a look at the big picture, when we take a look at everything that transpired, and when we look at both of these postseasons before I pivot. The postseasons, I'm sure the commissioners are ecstatic, but I would think that it has fallen way short. I mean, think about this. If you're the NBA, you had what? 2 Game 7s? You had Orlando, Cleveland, and Indiana and the Knicks, and we saw the Knicks just fall apart in front of our eyes there in that Game 7 with OG Anunoby playing the first few minutes, Jalen Brunson hurt, and you already had Mitchell Robinson out, Bojan Bogdanovic. I mean, the team was a mass unit by you got to the fourth quarter of that Game 7. So there was not a lot of intrigue, not a lot of drama. And obviously you did not have even any Game 6s, let alone Game 7s in a conference final. So the NBA, they need to have a great final here. They need to have a competitive final. They need to have a juicy final. And we'll talk more about it there on Thursday. And for the NHL, another scenario. You had 2 Game 6s, very good series here. It would have been great. I'm sure Gary Bettman one more time would have loved to have a Game 7 between Edmonton and Dallas with Edmonton winning, but you didn't get that. And your Game 7s, Edmonton, Vancouver was probably going to be the highlight of this postseason, considering down 3-2, they tied the series and then winning on the road in Vancouver. That may be your crowning moment at this point when it comes to the Stanley Cup Finals, because other than that, you had some Game 7s, but not a lot of intrigue, not a lot of drama, just another scenario where, yeah, Toronto, Boston in the first round, but that was the opening round of the series. Florida just pretty much blitzed right through, beat the Bruins in 6, beat Tampa in 5, Rangers in 6, Rangers swept the Capitals, and then beat the Hurricanes, although the Hurricanes had them on the ropes there, 3-1 in the third period of Game 6 when they were coming back from an 0-3 deficit, but that got squashed by Chris Kreider. And yeah, you didn't really have a lot of drama here in this postseason. So I'm hoping that you have 2 lengthy series, 2 good series, as we will zero in on that come Thursday's podcast. And then you have a couple other news and notes. I'll get to that more later in the week, some coaching hires and extensions there, but I want to move on because I want to keep this here in a tidy hour. Let me put on my cleats, get in the batter's box, and talk a little baseball. And the first thing that comes to mind, and I talked about them last week, and I'm going to talk about them one more time. On the good, and maybe not the bad, but just reminders. I have to put reminders out there, people, because I have to temper this with just a little bit. And I understand people are going to say, oh boy, it goes JAYREELZ now. There's got to be some Yankee hate that's coming down the pike here. And it's not necessarily hate, it's reality. Okay, so before you guys think that I'm going to throw ice cold water on the Yankees or ice cold water on Aaron Judge or Juan Soto or Luis Hill, no, not going to do that. But fasten your seatbelts, let's get right to it. Yankees, 42-19. What a road trip. West Coast trip, kind of old school when you think about it. Now, different because you had 2 National League teams. When you think back to the old days, and I'm talking about pre-94, when the Yankees had to go to Anaheim, the California Angels at that time, Oakland and Seattle. That was a true West Coast trip. And you saw that a lot, especially back in those days. Pre-94, I might add. Pre-wild card, etc. And this was a little bit unconventional, going to San Diego first, then Anaheim, American League city, but then they went to the Bay Area, not to play the Oakland A's, but the San Francisco Giants. And what did they do on this trip? Now, they started out this trip winning the first 2 games in San Diego. Then they lost the last 2. They lost the third game in San Diego, lost the first game in Anaheim. And then since then, they swept the remaining series, or the remaining 5 games, 2 against Anaheim and then 3 to the Giants, to where Aaron Judge has been on a rampage. Ever since he got off to that terrible start and when he got ejected, calling that on that called third strike where he was booted for the first time in his career, since then the guy has been not red hot. He has been white hot. To the point where he smacked home runs left and right. He hit, I don't know how many home runs in the month of June, not that it matters, but he hit a ton of home runs. Hit home runs in San Diego, hit home runs in Anaheim, hit 3 home runs over the weekend in Oracle with the Giants, and then top that off with Juan Soto's heroics day yesterday, hit a home run to start off the game against Blake Snell, and then down 5-4 in the ninth with a runner on, hits a 2-run homer. Yankees go on to sweep that series. Blake Snell back on the IL. Thankfully, they only signed him for 2 years, $31 million a year, and there you go, Scott Boras. If you wanted what? I believe they were looking for 7 years at almost $300 million, whatever it was. You can forget about it. And even that, with him coming off of a Cy Young year. But back to the Yankees. They have just been killer throughout the course of these last few weeks. They haven't lost a series in forever. And now as they continue their march with a very interesting week ahead. Now they have the Twins coming in after a day off today. Tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. That's not a big deal. They always kill the Twins. They swept them, a couple weeks ago. But they have the Dodgers coming into Yankee Stadium, which I'm fascinated and riveted to see how those two teams, because that could be a preview of the World Series come October. I get it. It's a long way up between now and then. But that is going to be a series a lot of people are going to be tuned into. I believe the first game's on Apple TV. Really? Ugh. But then you have a Fox game Saturday, ESPN Sunday. You couldn't ask for a better series here in the early part of June, and we'll talk more about that on Thursday. But for everything that's happened to the Yankees, 42-19, they have a 3-game lead in the division, although that is a little misleading because the Orioles have 4 games in hand on the Yankees, and they're only separated by 1 game and a loss, and that's what counts when it's all said and done. So for the Orioles, who are 37-20, Yankees are, as I mentioned, 42-19. Could this be, especially with the Twins coming in and they always kill the Twins, and we'll see what Baltimore plays this week, could the Yankees go run and hide in this AL East before it's all said and done? It's a little bit premature. I understand it's a little clickbaity. I'm not into the clickbait titles, but considering what they've done here, they have been on a tear. As I mentioned, 7-2 on this trip, 5 in a row. The Twins coming into town before LA, and that's going to be a much ballyhooed series. This is a huge week for the Bombers, and even bigger because tomorrow, Gerrit Cole is going to get on the mound for a rehab start. So let's see how that goes. Of course, he's probably going to be on a pitch limit, and who knows where that rehab start is. I don't know if that's going to be down in Tampa or if it's going to be here locally. But you have that for the Yankee fan who's going to be pumped up and ready to go to get their ace back in the rotation. And with Soto, him just being otherworldly, and you knew he was going to be, especially hitting ahead of Aaron Judge. That was no shock there. Check those receipts when the Yankees traded for Soto, and I'm going to get to him in a minute. But how he's performed, Giancarlo Stanton has done a hell of a lot better than he did last year, batting under the Mendoza line. He's hit, 12, 13 home runs, and he's batting in the 240, 250. For him, that's a vast improvement from what happened last year. Judge, I talked about. LeMahieu's back in the lineup. I know you'd like to see more from Gleyber Torres, but when you have Judge, Soto, Stanton, you have those 3 guys clicking, you know you're going to be on fire. But now, here's where the reality comes in. And this isn't cold water, people. These are just facts. Well, one is an observation. The other is a straight-up fact, and there's nothing you can say about it. Let's talk about Juan Soto. A couple weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, we talked about how Soto, who is having a killer year, could even have an MVP year, and who knows if Judge or Soto are going to cancel each other out when it's all said and done. But both of those guys are having MVP-type years, as we know. But for Soto, who we talked about, that is open to discussions as far as an extension on his contract. We all know he's in a walk year. He's a free agent at the end of this year. And Hal Steinbrenner did make a comment saying that it's not feasible for this organization, especially with the luxury tax, and they're paying Judge $36 million a year. They're paying Cole $36 million a year. They're paying Stanton in upwards of almost $30 million a year. I know the Marlins are on the hook for some of that. But you got those 3 guys right off the bat that are getting paid enormous amounts of money. And remember, Juan Soto turned down a $440 million deal with the Nationals, 2020, 2021, before he was traded in 2022. Soto, with the stats he's putting up this year, he's going to ask starting with a 5. No ifs, ands, buts, maybes about it. And remember, his agent is Scott Boras. And Hal Steinbrenner has said they have to be fiscally responsible. Now, you know he's going to do whatever it takes. And the pressure cooker for the fan base, it's going to be on him to re-sign this guy. Now, I understand. They're going to have to look under their seat cushions and find out how much money it's going to cost to re-sign this guy in the dotted line. And remember, he's 26 years old? So he's going to ask for easily, minimum, a 10-year contract. You didn't give Judge a 10-year contract, and you're going to pay him well more than what Aaron Judge is making at 9 years or $360 million. So just think about that, people, just from the periphery. But now, here's where it gets tricky. Who do you have in the minors that obviously doesn't cost you anything close to what Soto's making, and 2 guys that are actually on the come up to be stars and future superstars and maybe even a face of the sport in the next 5-7 years? There's a guy named Spencer Jones who plays left field, who I actually got to see on Saturday for the Somerset Patriots, the AA team of the Yankees. Big guy, they call him the left-handed Aaron Judge, 6'6", I believe he's 215, has the height, but certainly doesn't have the girth and the big body. He looks like Jimmy Graham, tight end of the Saints. Doesn't have that physique, but a guy that has a lot of power, and if you're going to be compared to the left-handed Aaron Judge, then obviously that is big shoes to fill. And then you also have the Martian. Have you forgotten about him, people? The guy who had to leave toward the end of last year with a UCL injury, that he's on the recovery. And when I saw him the other night, Jason Dominguez hit a home run, a shot down the right field line that cleared the fence. A guy that is 19 years old, that is compared to Mickey Mantle. Switch hitter, short in stature, but packs a big wallop. And you saw the little sample size that he had last year when he came up. His first ever at bat. Granted, it was the Crawford boxes where I could probably hit a home run out of that building in Houston. First ever at bat in the major leagues against Justin Verlander. Hit a home run. And I believe hit about 4 or 5 home runs in that sample size that he had for the Yankees. He's a guy that's going to be in that lineup probably, if not next year, the year after that. And you're going to pay him $700,000. So are you going to look at it from the big picture, Yankee fans, or especially the front office? Are we going to sign Soto long term? He's been relatively healthy, has not had a lot of injuries throughout the course of his career, which is one thing you knock on wood if you're a Yankee fan, especially if you're going to sign him to that contract. But if you have Spencer Jones who can play left field, and if you have Dominguez who can play center field, and you move Judge back to right, cut the cost. Dominguez is a rising star. Spencer Jones maybe could fit in with those aforementioned guys in the lineup with Judge and Stanton, of course, with Dominguez. And it's not going to cost you 4 arms, a leg, and your firstborn. That's number one. Here's the reality, though, that I got to share with the Yankee fan. Remember who your manager is, especially come October. And that's all I need to say. Because the Yankee fans I know in my life, they have come out and said they want Aaron Boone gone. And remember, he's in a walk year. 42-19, they're going to have a big regular season. They're going to play in a division series. They don't have to worry about wild card. They're going to have that 5-day rest period. So you got to wait and see what's going to happen there, people. But let's see what's going to happen in October. Because we know Aaron Boone, who's made it to ALCSs. But if you're going to have a big-time year and have a bye in the first round and get yourself set up to where it's World Series a bust and you don't get to a World Series this year and maybe Cleveland, dare I say, picks you off, or if Houston has a rally in them, now I think they'd be due to beat Houston because Houston has beaten them like a drum over the years, or maybe have a matchup with the Orioles, and the Orioles got a little bit of experience last year getting swept. Maybe it's time for them to take the next step. Who knows? But your manager, remember who he is in big spots. And if he doesn't deliver this year, do you want him back next year? And Hal's in love with them. And Brian Cashman, chances are he's going to come back after this big regular season unless he gets swept in the postseason or in a division series. Keep those receipts, people, as we get deeper into this baseball season. So I had to start off with that because the Yankees have just been hot as a pistol and have played well. And I know that the Guardians have played well here. And they've been more than what I've ever thought or even imagined for that matter. 39-20, but they can't compete, I think, with the Orioles or the Yankees, especially in the American League. And then you have, of course, Seattle, who is at the top of the West, where Houston They are 7 games back, and I don't know. I said it, and I'm going to stick to it. I get it that they could parachute into the wild card when it's all said and done, but I'm going to say it. This is the year where the Astros don't click and not make it to the postseason. But I get it. They're still probably within distance of the wild card, but we'll have to wait and see on that. But you've had a lot of injuries come down the pike here over the last week or so, whether it was Blake Snell had to leave yesterday with that groin, as I talked about before. And I know the Giants are scratching their head over that signing, and I get it. They try to make a splash, but Snell, I believe he's 0-3 with an ERA of 9.5. Yeah, how's that $31 million working for you there, San Francisco Giants? And then you've also had his former teammates, Yu Darvish and Joe Musgrove. They're on the IL as well. Who knows for how long, but the Padres, as they're trying to find their way, and although they play pretty well, 2 games over 500, they're not going to be a threat to the Dodgers in the West, but you would think they're going to be part of that wild card mix. Who knows how long those 2 guys will be out, so that's something that we're going to have to keep in mind here. And then what else we have? I didn't talk about Angel Hernandez. Good riddance. I'll spend 10 seconds on that. Made a settlement with Major League Baseball. Retires, awful umpire with his terrible strike zones, and there's a guy that everybody wanted out and put to pasture a long time ago. Well, he got a settlement. It was time. And I'm sure it was best for both parties, for him, Major League Baseball, so you don't have to worry about Angel Hernandez ever again being behind home plate in a big playoff game or just in any game for that matter. And then Darryl Strawberry, I know he had his number retirement the other day. I want to give kudos to him, and that's not to knock Dwight Gooden, who had his jersey retired earlier this year. I love Dwight, especially early on what he did in that uniform, the K corner, etc. But Darryl is big in my heart. When he signed with the Dodgers there in 90, I was devastated. I even had, believe it or not, I don't have any photos of it, but I had a Strawberry t-shirt where I put a black band around it the day he signed with the Dodgers because he was my all-time favorite Met, and it was sad to see him go, and I get it. He went to LA to go back home and signed that big deal. I even went to his first game back at Shea, May 7th, 1991. You can look that up on baseballreference.com. Hit a home run against Frank Viola in his first game back and just pummeled the Mets in that first game. And even in those first couple of series, I remember hitting a 3-run homer off David Cone, coming back to Shea in the second go-around. Remember that, people? I talked about it earlier. Prior to 94, you had scenarios, there was no interleague, and the West Coast teams made it to New York twice a year on 2 trips. And his second go-around, his first at-bat, hit a 3-run homer. And then in the following at-bat, I believe Gary Carter, who was a member of the Dodgers, also hit a home run. He may have hit a double. But anyway, so for Darryl to get his retirement and even made a big apology to the fans, telling him that, I'm sorry, I left you guys, should have never left. Boy, it would have been great to see Darryl in a Met uniform throughout the course of his entire career, but didn't happen. But kudos to him. He deserved it. I know with everything that happened off the field, same for Doc, a lot of people could question whether or not they should get their number retired. But you know what? They made their mark. They won a championship, and they were Hall of Fame talents that should have been in Met uniforms throughout the course of their entire careers. So you know what? They deserve that honor. They deserve to get their numbers retired. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix as well. Now, yeah, I went through some standings here. Everything is pretty much the same. But one thing I will say, now that I digress for a sec, the one thing I will say is that there are a lot of big leads in Major League Baseball here when we take a look at the divisions. And we know we have the wild card as the safety net. But even though, like I mentioned, with the Orioles, 1 game and a loss for 3 games. But think about this. 5 games and a loss of the Royals behind the Guardians. 4. That's not a sizable lead, but that's a nice lead. You can get swept and the Royals could sweep, and you still have first place if, let's say, we get to Thursday, depending on which teams play against one another. But then you have Seattle, 3 in a loss, but a 4-game lead there. The Phillies have a 5 in the loss, but 6.5 game lead over the Braves. Dodgers, 7, 6.5, and that's lost to games behind. And then the Brewers, 6 in the loss and 7 behind in the division. So you have a lot of the division leaders have a decent enough lead or sizable lead as we get into the opening week of June. So that's something you got to keep in mind of, and something we'll obviously monitor from here on out. And as far as your schedule here for the early part of the week, you have, I talked about later in the week, which we'll get into, Dodgers, Yankees, and you also have the Mets going to London to play the Phillies, and I'll get into that also on Thursday. Mets are playing in Washington for the first 3 days, and I believe they have an afternoon game on Wednesday, so they can get an early jump on their trip to London as they're going to play that series Saturday and Sunday. But your series this week, we're talking about Yankees Twins. Milwaukee plays at Philadelphia, so you have two first-place teams there, and that starts tonight. So that's a series to look out for. Very interesting series between those two teams. Baltimore and Toronto, for the Blue Jay fan, as they're trying to get back into the swing of things. Atlanta playing the Red Sox. You have your North Side versus the South Side. Chicago, Cubs, and White Sox. San Diego, they're playing I thought they're playing the Dodgers, but the Dodgers, that's not the case. They're playing the Angels, where the Dodgers are playing the Pirates before they come to New York over the weekend. Yeah, those are your big series. Tampa and Miami, if you want to talk about your Florida series. Kansas City at Cleveland. Oh, there you go. So, right off the bat, Kansas City at Cleveland, they're going to play 3 games. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I believe. So even if they were to sweep the Royals, they will still be in first place when it's all said and done. So let's see, maybe some separation between Cleveland and Kansas City. That's a sneaky series that a lot of people normally wouldn't pay attention to, but because the Royals are 4 games back in the division, let's see if they can creep up a little bit, maybe win 2 out of 3 to gain a game. So that's what you have there with baseball, as we will really start to concentrate on that moving forward, as we're now into the finals with the NBA and NHL. And let me close out with a couple of quickies, as I know now I'm at the 1 hour mark. So let me tidy this up real swiftly. Now, the NFL, I'll start there. I'll get to the French Open in a second. You had a big-time signing in the sport where, no, not Jalen Waddle, who signed for 4 years, 84, almost $85 million, $76 million guaranteed. Well, the Minnesota Vikings and Justin Jefferson, or at least his representative, said, Jalen Waddle, hold my beer. As I put on the helmet and shoulder pads, they just signed, or the word came down this morning, that Jefferson signed a 4-year deal, $140 million, but that's not even the big thing. $110 million guaranteed. The biggest contract given to a non-quarterback in the history of the sport. That's right. So that would top any offensive lineman, any pass rusher, by far any running back, obviously wide receiver, safety, corner, you name it. He is getting more than any other player besides a quarterback, guaranteed. And we know Jefferson is a all-pro wide receiver, and he deserves every nickel that he gets. But now you have a scenario going into this year where he's gotten all this money, and Kirk Cousins was his quarterback. And Cousins, as we know, he's a run-of-the-mill 10 to 15. He's not a top 10 quarterback. But now you're going to have Sam Darnold, who is a bottom-run quarterback, and then you drafted J.J. McCarthy from Michigan, who is, yeah, I get it. He has championship DNA, played at a big university, but a lot of people thought could be a little bit of a reach where the Vikings drafted him there a little bit over a month ago. Now, those guys are going to get Justin Jefferson the ball. It's not as if those guys are all pros or Pro Bowl type caliber quarterbacks. So that's not going to be an indictment if Jefferson's not getting the ball, or if you draft him on your fantasy team and you're in week 5 and he only has 12 catches for 240 yards, where he could get that pretty much in a game. So keep that in mind, fantasy owners, and keep that in mind, football fans, that even though he's got the big money and is a top-flight wide receiver, no doubt, but who's going to throw him the ball? A guy that is on his 4th team and won Sam Darnold, or a guy that is just getting drafted and is going to find out quick, fast, in a hurry if he is the starter under center come week 1, how I'm going to read these NFL defenses and try to get the ball to our all-pro and top-paid wide receiver certainly remains to be seen. So just keep that in mind, as we're still months away from the NFL season. Now, as I break out my tennis racket to get to the French Open, not a lot has gone on here, where you still have a lot of the big dogs there, both on the men's and women's side. I know we talk about Iga Swiatek had that scare from Naomi Osaka, as she was able to thwart a big-time upset, and now continues her quest to get her 3rd straight French Open in 4 of the last 5 years. But you had Novak Djokovic, who played until 3:07 in the morning a couple nights ago, which is an absolute joke. And I know even Coco Gauff said that's not healthy for these players, because if you're going to play into the wee hours of the morning, and by the time you finish at 3:07 and you have your media commitments, you have to share a word or two based on the match. Shower. I'm sure you got to eat something. I know you're not going to have a big meal, but you got to have something considering that you just sweated out 4.5 hours. In this case, Novak Djokovic, when he finally beat Lorenzo Mazzetti there at, 3:07 on Sunday morning. And to come down from a long match and shower, get ready, go back to your hotel room or villa or wherever you're staying at, and then get to bed, which could be about 6, 7 in the morning. Granted, you don't have a match that day, but now your body is thrown off, your circadian rhythm, etc. And for Djokovic, we would think he'll be fine. And a lot of people think that he has gas in his tank now to get himself back to a final, maybe win a final, which would be remarkable. Because we talked about this 2 Thursdays ago, how I thought that this tournament was wide open, considering Djokovic has not been himself this year, or really in this last recent stretch, was ousted in a lot of these small tournaments. A guy that was even ousted, Jannik Sinner, won the Australian Open. And for Djokovic, maybe this could have been the beginning of the end, as we could see his downward slide. Not going to say toward oblivion, but maybe his top ranked, although he's still ranked number 1 in the world, is not going to be long-lived and maybe short-lived, but he is certainly a warrior and a battler, so we'll see coming into this week how he's going to perform. And yes, they got to do something with the times and adjust that. We saw that with the US Open, I believe with Carlos Alcaraz last year, where he played until 4 in the morning or whatever it was. They can't play. There should be a cutoff time. And if they can't move up these matches, because I believe the previous matchup, off the top of my head, I can't remember who it was, but for them to start at that time, which I believe was 9:37 or whatever it was, and was 4.5 hours, they got to start these matches a little bit earlier, because when you get to the 4 and 5 set matches, we've seen these matches go 5.5 hours. And it really is unfair. I don't care how conditioned these players are. They cannot play until 3:07 in the morning. That is just a disgrace. They got to figure that out. And not even just this tournament, whether it's Wimbledon or US Open or even Australian, they have to move these matches up to make this at least more palatable for these players to finish maybe no later than 1 a.m. And even that's a little bit late, but we understand you can't start every match at 6 o'clock, and if it goes 5.5 hours to play till midnight, sometimes you got to start at 7 or 8. But still, 3 in the morning, that's a disgrace. So they got to fix that. But like I mentioned, a lot of the top players are still there on both sides. We'll wait and see what's going to happen here. Looking forward to it, and we'll see if there's going to be any changeover come on Thursday's podcast. And then lastly, as we go into the octagon, Dustin Poirier. Is this the end for him? Now, I know he's been trying to get that elusive lightweight title. He did not get that on Saturday night against Islam Makhachov. You know me with these names. I butcher them all the time. And Makhachov went right at him from the start, takedown, and it was not necessarily a struggle, but it was certainly going to be an uphill battle for Poirier. And Poirier, you could argue whether or not he belongs on the Mount Rushmore for UFC as a guy that, with his reputation, with his just everything that he's brought to the sport and to the, I guess you could say, league, UFC on a whole. And granted that he has not gotten that lightweight championship. And even in the post-match, I know he tapped in in the 5th round where Makhachov won. And for Poirier to say at 35 years of age, and we know he's been around, he's now 30 and 10 lifetime. And a lot of talk maybe about Conor McGregor, and even though he said that ship's unsailed, but who knows, maybe for the right dollar amount, he could come back. But 35 years of age, post-match, he said that he has a little girl and a family to look after. He doesn't know how much more he has left. And I don't know if that's a telltale sign for him to think that this could be the beginning of the end for Poirier, and I won't say that it is. But the signs are pointing in that direction, knowing that it's a brutal sport, a lot of training, a lot of sacrifice. I don't have to tell you guys, and I don't have to be an MMA expert to even get into that. Because you know it takes more than a lot to just get in that octagon for just one ring, let alone 5 rings, or let alone 5 rounds. I said rings, excuse me. Let alone 5 rounds. It just goes to show you my MMA lack of expertise or my MMA novice that I am. But you don't have to be that type of aficionado or a mixed martial arts guy to figure out that when you get to a certain stage of your life and you've gotten into so many wars throughout the course of your career, and knowing that, yes, you still are trying to get that carrot that's dangled in front of you, whether it's money, whether it's a lightweight championship, a belt, fame, fortune, recognition, everything. But there does come a point where you have to think about the end game, the long-term effects, everything that this brutal and grueling sport deals you when you put in that time, energy, and effort. And right, I'm not telling you guys and gals anything you don't know, but still, I don't know if it's the end just yet. I won't say that. He just came out of that match, and I'm sure just exhausted and obviously crestfallen, knowing that he didn't get the title, and now he has to do this all over again. Maybe as the days go on, he'll talk with his family, he'll gather his thoughts, and maybe give it another crack or another go. We'll see. But I would think, and this is no shock, that the end is much closer than the beginning for Poirier, but we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen there, obviously in the days and weeks to come. But kudos to him for getting in there, battling it out, and trying to get that lightweight championship, and hopefully he gets another opportunity if he wants to gear up and try to do that again, whether a rematch is in store or something else down the line for Poirier, as he gave it us all there in a loss Saturday night. And it wasn't in Vegas. It was actually on the other side of the river at the Prudential Center. So one more time, kudos to Poirier, and even congratulations to Makhachov. That'll do it, my good people. Another episode in the books. I know this went past an hour, but where else are you going to get all this in one podcast? I mean, come on. I'm waiting. I'm listening. And if that's the case, I want to know, because I'm in competition with myself. But all this in one podcast, where else are you going to get it? I don't know. But thank God and thank goodness you stopped here and carved precious time out of your day to listen to what it is I have to say about what goes on in the toy department of the world when it comes to sports. If you haven't done so, like I mentioned at the top, subscribe, rate, review on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe on YouTube at JAYREELZ, as I post content there daily. And also, if you want to hit me up with a question, comment, suggestion, do so at the following: Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, of course, YouTube as well. The JAYREELZ podcast for those three platforms. Again, JAYREELZ just for YouTube, but the JAYREELZ podcast for IG, FB, and also TikTok, Twitter, X, JAYREELZ1, just the number, the old-fashioned way, the JAYREELZ podcast at gmail.com. I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals, because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to do, people. It's in the blood, it's in the DNA, talking sports from birth, with nothing but passion, fire, energy, fury, with my thoughts, opinions, feelings, analysis, critiques, praise, as I'm tongue-tied here on anything and everything that happens on the world of the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the JAYREELZ podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx, the South Beach, the South Center, the South Pacific, and all points beyond, peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the JAYREELZ podcast, on the flip, baby.